Hello, my name is Eric Staten II, and today I will be discussing the the Menominee tribe, and environmental justice, and expanding on my earlier presentation that we had in a previous lecture by going deeper into the historical, cultural, scientific, and environmental decisions of this topic. Environmental justice is the idea that all people, regardless of race, income, or background, have the right to a healthy environment and should not bear an unequal share of environmental harm. For Indigenous people, the environmental justice is inseparable from land, sovereignty, and survival. The Menominee tribe of Wisconsin provides one of the strongest real-world examples of how Indigenous land stewardship, cultural knowledge, and modern science can work together to protect ecosystems over the long term. This discussion will cover the Menominee people's origins, their historical relationship with the United States, the land back movement, their sustainable forestry practices, cultural principles guiding those practices, and how their work contributes to environmental science today, and other examples of how we can learn from Native American sustainability practices and how they do not clash with Western scientific methods. Who are the Menominee people? The Menominee tribe is an Algonquin indigenous group of people, meaning they are part of a big family with like the Creeks and other tribes, and they settle into what is now considered northwestern Wisconsin and parts of Michigan. The name comes from the word Namamakrokta. Apologies for mispronouncing that word, meaning the people of the wild rice, which reflects both their resilience on the environment and their deep relationship with specific ecosystems. For thousands of years, the Menominee lived sustainably within forested landscapes, rivers, and wetlands, and the culture, economy, and spiritual practices were closely tied to land. Rather than viewing land as property, the Menominee understood it as a living system that humans are responsible for maintaining. The worldview showed how resources were used, hunting, fishing, gathering, and forestry were conducted with restraint and respect, and ensure that future generations could survive on the same land. This long-term perspective is central to understanding why the Menominee approach to environmental stewardship remains so effective today. Historical context. The Menominee tribe relationship with the United States has been shaped by a long series of treaties and federal policies that steadily reduced their land-based and political autonomy. In 1821, the Menominee signed an early treaty acknowledging U.S. authority, beginning formal relations that would later lead to land loss. This was followed by the Treaty of 1821, which forced the Menominee to cede millions of acres of land in Wisconsin, and Michigan. These land cessions were justified by the US government as necessary for settlement and economic expansion, but they were devastating to the tribe's territorial integrity. The Treaty of 1831 and the Treaty of 1836 further stripped Menominee of large portions of the homeland, and even though the tribe attempted to resist removal, unlike many Native American tribes, the Menominee strongly opposed relocation west of the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, we forced to move. In the Treaty of 1841, the U.S. government attempted to remove the Menominee entirely, assigning them land in Minnesota. However, land was unsuitable, and the tribe refused to relocate. After continued resistance, the Treaty of 1854 established permanent Menominee reservation in Wisconsin. But this treaty allowed for the tribe to remain on the part of the ancestral land. It represented only a fraction of the original territory. And despite retaining forested land, federal control continued to undermine Menominee sovereignty. The most damaging policy came into effect in the 1950s with the Termination Act, when Congress ended Menominee federal recognition, which meant that tribal lands were converted into Menominee County, which became part of the state of Wisconsin. Property taxes were imposed, land was sold, and poverty sharply increased. Environmental management deteriorated as tribal authority was removed, and only in 1973, followed through sustained activism by the Menominee, the Menominee Restoration Act was passed into Congress, and reinstated federal recognition. This restoration was critical not only for political sovereignty but also for environmental justice, as it allowed the tribe to reclaim over half, not over half, over the reclaim control over land management and restore sustainable forestry practices. Now, what did that sustainable activism look like? Well, the land back movement advocates for the return of indigenous lands to indigenous peoples. While it's often misunderstood as simply reclaiming territory, land back is also about restoring sovereignty for cultural practices. And for many tribes, land is not purely only a source of economic survival, but also the foundation of identity, spirituality, and governance. Without control over land, indigenous nations cannot fully protect sacred sites, manage ecosystems, or practice traditional knowledge systems. The Menominee case illustrates how land back functions in practice. When the tribe regained authority over the land, they were able to immediately reinstate sustainable forestry methods that promotes long-term forest health over short-term profit. And this shows that land back is not just a political movement; it is an environmental solution. And what do those practices look like? Well, the Menominee tribe is internationally known and recognized for its advanced and sustainable forestry practices, which combine traditional knowledge with modern forestry science. One of the core methods used is selective harvesting, where individual trees are carefully chosen based on age, species, forest density, and ecological impact. Trees are marked by trained foresters, ensuring that harvesting maintains forest structure and biodiversity. Clear cutting is avoided entirely, and the tribe uses long-term forest management plans, often spanning decades rather than short-term economic cycles. Harvest levels are deliberately capped below annual forest growth, meaning the forest regenerates faster than it's harvested. This ensures continuous canopy cover, protects wildlife habitats, and prevents soil erosion. The Menominee forestry also emphasizes species diversity, maintaining mixed age and mixed species stands rather than monoculture plantations. This increases resilience to disease, pests, and climate change. Fallen trees in deadwood are often left in place to support nutrient cycling and wildlife. And modern tools such as GIS mapping, forest inventories, and ecological monitoring are used alongside traditional practices, and the Menominee work with professional foresters, ecologists, and institutions such as the U.S. Forest Service, universities, and conservation organizations to conduct research and maintain certification standards. And the forest is FSC certified, meaning Forest Stewardship Council, meaning it meets rigorous international sustainability criteria. This certification demonstrates that indigenous-led forestry can meet and exceed global environment standards while remaining economically viable. And what does the cultural principles of economic knowledge do for us and look like for them? Well, the Menominee land stewardship is deeply rooted in cultural teachings, our oral histories, and traditional ecological knowledge passed down through generations. One key cultural principle is the belief that the forest is relative, not a resource. Trees are treated as living beings with spiritual significance, and this belief discourages extraction and promotes respect for natural cycles. All histories describe how the Menominee learned to manage forests by observing natural disturbance patterns, such as windstorms and disease, and then mimicking these processes through selective harvesting. And this approach allows for the forest to regenerate naturally without large-scale disruption. Another guiding teaching is responsibility to the seventh generation, meaning that every decision must consider its impact on people far into the future, and this principle directly informs harvesting limits and regeneration timelines and conservation priorities. Traditional ecological knowledge also includes detailed understanding of wildlife behavior, soil regulations, and seasonal cycles. For example, certain areas are left untouched to protect animals and breeding grounds, medicinal plants, and sacred sites. In cultural ceremonies, stories, and teachings reinforce the idea that harming the land ultimately harms the community itself, and this worldview it's a more obligation to maintain ecological balance, an obligation that continues to guide Menominee forestry and environmental decision making today. And how does this connect to environmental science? Well, the Menominee Forest has become a valuable site for scientific research. Environmental scientists study it to understand sustainable forestry, biodiversity preservation, and long-term ecosystem resilience. Research has shown that forests managed by indigenous people often outperform um, government or corporate managed lands in terms of biodiversity, climate change, and supports the idea that indigenous knowledge is not separate from science, rather complementary, and an essential form of environmental expertise. And their work contributes to climate change mitigation by maintaining carbon-rich forests and reducing ecosystem distribution. And this makes their land stewardship globally relevant and not just locally significant. And why does this matter? The Menominee tribe's experience demonstrates that environmental justice cannot exist without indigenous sovereignty. When land is returned to indigenous stewardship, ecosystems benefit. Stewardship um, is passed on. Communities recover, sustainable practices thrive, and the land back movement is not about the past, it is about the future. The Menominee show that restoring indigenous control over land offers real solutions to environmental degradation, climate change, ecological instability, by recognizing and supporting indigenous land rights. And we are not only addressing historical injustice, but also embracing proven methods of environmental sustainability that benefit everyone. And thank you.